Perfect.
Cool. Start. Okay, welcome guys to Indie Comix Fest. I'm Falah Faisal. I'm a comedian from Bangalore. I create a superhero called Musalman, the Muslim superhero, and this is the graphic novel that I've created. His superpower is that he's equally offensive to everybody. And with me is Atheeth. Atheeth can introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Atheeth. I've been an indie comics creator for the past 6-7 years. I'm an illustrator artist. I'm based in Kochi. I've self-published a few comics. This is my first one. I don't have copies here. I'm sorry this time, but like probably next time I'll bring some. But yeah, we're just here to talk about comics and superheroes and all things, everything.
I think we can just like. Do you guys like superheroes to begin with? Like, can you tell us which one's your favorite, if you don't mind? Do you have a favorite superhero? Spider-Man. Anybody?
Everyone starts with Spider-Man.
Actually, like my first experience with superheroes was Batman, and unfortunately, the first superhero movie that I watched was Batman and Robin, the terrible one.
It's a really bad one.
Because Arnold Schwarzenegger was the villain, Mr. Freeze, and I used to
He gets stopped billing in the movie as well.
yeah. So my first experience was watching Batman and Robin in the theater was how I was introduced to superheroes. Like, what was your?
I think first movie I ever saw in a theater was probably Spider-Man 1.
Spider-Man 1 too.
Yeah, like I remember being very scared by watching Spider-Man 1 because Willem Dafoe is just like a scary guy. So like, and then I think Brian Michael Bendis Ultimate Spider-Man comics is how I got into comics. Because we used to get comics, but we didn't have like actual bookstores don't carry them in like sequence, right? So I would get like a issue 5, and then an issue 16, and then an issue 32, and I would have no idea what's going on. I'd be like, all of them end on like a cliffhanger. They're like, okay, do we continue to the next issue? I don't have the next issue. So that's how I started drawing comics, because I would just make it up. I would just get like notebooks and I would start sketching. Then I'm like, okay, this is what probably happened in between the issues that I actually read. And
so you start imagining the gaps in between.
Yeah. That's like a important thing about like just imagination as a child also, because that's how you grow that, right? Like if you don't know, you find interesting explanation.
How old were you when you were doing?
Maybe like 4th grade, like 3rd grade.
3rd grade, 4th grade. Yeah. I think my introduction to comics was like almost accidental, because like I had an older cousin brother. He was studying in Manipal, and then he was shifting to Chennai. So he had a whole collection of his comic books. And when he was shifting, he had a house in Bangalore, and he dumped all of his comic books at our house. So the corner of my parents' bedroom was like stacks of comics that belonged to my cousin. So when I picked those up, those were like the first comics I read. And funnily, how it happened is that there was this company back in the 90s called Gotham Comics. I don't know if you guys have heard of. Gotham used to reprint like DC and Marvel comics for really cheap for Indian audience, like 10 rupees, 15 rupees. But in the early 2000s or so, they were going out of business, and their godown was like next to my house, like a street away from my house. So this uncle who used to like still like take care of the stuff would let me sit and come and read over there for free, like, or like buy for really cheap. So all the Mad magazines, X-Men, Avengers, Batman. So like thinking back, that almost feels like my own personal origin story. Like a go down of comic books is right next to your house, and they're going out of business. So you have access to all the comics you can imagine.
Yeah.
And then there was Blossoms, a very famous bookstore in Bangalore. They also used to have these stacks. And I remember I used to like bunk school, use my lunch money to buy comics and like read those comics. So for me, like growing up, X-Men, Wolverine is still a favorite of mine. Like, I think when X-Men Origin Wolverine came, I grew out my beard and I like made the sideburns and stuff. So Wolverine and Batman were like my two favorite growing up.
Yeah, like X-Men I feel like is a I think like when I started reading seriously, like comics seriously, one of the first things I did was like read old like Chris Claremont, like old X-Men comics. Because I was just like, that was my guy. Like those were my guys. It was Spider-Man, obviously, and then X-Men. So and like those are the movies also. Like those are the first like kind of superhero films you end up seeing at my like age group anyway. So like X-Men is like a good segue to like talk about, I think, the importance of like how to like Trojan horse like important like, social commentary, or like just in general like good sociology through comics. Because if you read X-Men, you automatically get like a lot of information from that like stays with you. Like it's generally about being against prejudice, right? Like they don't have to like spoon feed you exactly what kind of information, like what
Yeah.
kind of.
But even if you go
ideology.
all the way back, right, the first superhero that the world knows is Superman, and Superman was created by Jerry Schuster.
Yeah.
And like both the people who created Superman were Jewish immigrants, and
Post World War
they
II.
struggled to fit into American society, sort of a thing. So like Superman was a way to create the ideal immigrant, like project that image. So it was, superheroes have always been a tool for minorities to talk
Yeah.
about their issues in this sort of a way. And X-Men kind of does that in a way where sexual minorities, racial minorities, everything comes into the picture. Where the mutants itself are representation of various minorities that were present in the counterculture era of the 1960s and
Yeah,
stuff.
and like during the 60s, also in the US, the civil rights movement is happening.
Yeah.
And like Magneto and Professor X are supposed to be like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, basically. Like the names are kind of swapped, right? But like I don't think the creators have come out and said this outwardly, but like it's fairly obvious. Like one has a very extreme take on mutant rights, one has a very like pacifistic take on like mutant rights, right? So these are all things that are reflections of society that like come out in comics, and like you can Trojan horse a lot of complicated ideas secretly into comics, and like you can get very young people to like look into this and from a very young age understand that hey, maybe hating someone based on like differences in skin, differences in like where you're from, all of these things is probably not a good idea. Like these things, you grow up with those ideas even though they're not being spoon fed to you directly, being like okay, no, don't be.
I mean, but even like one of the most famous images of Captain America is him punching Hitler on the cover. So there's no subtlety there. Also, you can really be overt and in your face about it.
Yeah, I think that's also like a time period where they had to do that. Like
It's
they're
like
trying to
part of
enlist
the
people to the army to like fight Hitler. So the best way to do that is be like, hey, here's a guy who's punching Hitler. So join this guy and fight Hitler. So yeah, Captain America is also another interesting. So basically, that's the idea, right? Like if you try to like think about that, like your comics from that standpoint, basically, it's a reflection of what's going on in society right now.
Carrying forward legacy, because especially when I created Musalman, I think I created in 2017, and I think post 2014, there's been a wave where like Muslims are demonized. They're shown as public enemy number one. They're like sort of like the traitors, villains. Even right now, there's a movie playing in theaters, which is a 4-hour propaganda piece that's all about Muslims bad. This is the end message, right? So for me, like growing up and in a family where all my uncles are Muslims, my cousins are Muslims, it's not as horrible as what I see on TV. So sometimes it was just a way to like maybe like show that okay, this exists, and for the next generation to have a positive representation of a character they can look up to, look forward to, and symbol of hope of sorts, sort of thing. So that was like what was in my mind in a way to create Musalman. I think like earlier it was like an edgy comic where I'd make like short stories that were like in your face. But in 2019, this thing happened in India called the CAA protests. Like there was like an anti-CAA movement when the government passed the CAA bill, and I was like as a journalist, I was covering these protests, I was interviewing people. So when I was like in that process, it kind of like started changing my perspective also, because I come from a very privileged liberal bubble in Bangalore. I don't think I faced Islamophobia or discrimination firsthand based on the neighborhoods I lived or in the schools I went to. But when I saw this and this being peddled in the news, in the mainstream, and how people from a different strata who are also Muslims are being affected, that kind of changed how I saw Musalman as a character, what Musalman needed to be in that time changed based on the CAA protests. And then like it was also like lockdown happened, and then the protests were all of a sudden over. So you could no longer get out on the street and say shit about the government. You had to stay at home. So Musalman came around at that time where this book basically got written.
Everyone go check it out at the stall.
It's at the stall. But it's like one of the things, right? A lot of people don't realize one thing that superheroes do different from everybody else is that we wear underwear on the outside. A lot of people like always ask me, dude, why is the superheroes wearing underwear on the outside? And I finally know the answer to that. So when the earliest superheroes were created, they were modeled after circus strongmen. Like in circus, you had all these people who lift weights and all, and they dress a certain way and they'd wear underwear on the outside. So when the earliest artists drew like the superheroes, then they modeled the costume on this likeness, which is why superheroes even now wear underwear on the outside.
Do you like Superman with the underwear on the outside or inside?
I like the James Gunn Superman more than I like the Zack Snyder Superman. So yes, on the outside.
Probably controversial. I know Zack Snyder has a lot of.
No, Zack Snyder is not a good filmmaker. I don't know why people like go on.
We're supposed to be not controversial here, so like.
He made one good superhero movie, that's Watchmen, and that's because the source material was good.
Yeah, and he basically adapted it one to one. Watchmen's amazing.
Yeah. Coming to Watchmen, like I think the superheroes like went through an evolution during the 80s, where like because a lot of times people consider superheroes to be a child's medium, right? Kids read comic books or whatever. But in the 80s, there was an evolution and moved towards graphic novels, where like you had artists
take it seriously.
Alan Moore, Frank Miller. These were artists like Frank Miller did Dark Knight Returns, which is the older Batman story. Alan Moore did V for Vendetta and From Hell, and all of these things that made superhero comics itself seem appropriate for the adult, mature audience to read, and that created a shift in the conversation of what people thought of as comic books.
Yeah, and like you have stuff like Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, works by Mark Miller, Neil Gaiman, even though we don't like Neil Gaiman anymore. But like, did a lot of things for changing the narrative in general about comic books being like a children's medium. And I think like that's the thing. I feel like at a very young age, I got a hold of like a lot of like Swamp Thing, Alan Moore comics.
Where? Yeah.
Vertigo. Like I think they just had.
No, but where were we picking
bookstores? Like books. They would just have like a bundle of comics in the back, and like they would not know how to like serialize it. So I used to get like really inappropriate for my age comic books. I think someone was already mentioned like they saw some of my work and they saw like a lot of Spawn influence. Like I got Spawn comics. I was not supposed to be reading Spawn comics. Spawn comics are notoriously very violent. It's mostly set in hell. There's demons. There's like guts being ripped out. So like from a very young age, I got exposed to like a lot of really strange stuff that I think has carried over into like my kind of psychology when I'm making comics. I make a lot of like horror. I make a lot of like science fiction, like kind of weird stuff. So I think it comes from the things that I was exposed to, and this is also like a function of comics being taken more in like a darker direction, which I think is also like a function of how like the attitude of like
reflect the society of the time,
right?
I think a lot of us also were introduced to superheroes through the movies as well, like the movies. You guys, do you remember which was your favorite first superhero movie that you remember seeing? Was it Marvel? Was it Spider-Man? Huh? Batman Begins, yeah, because that is a seminal thing, because right, like Batman had almost been dormant for like 10 odd years until Christopher Nolan came and revamped the whole medium, right? Like
they did that same thing in the comics around like the whole Neil Adams time.
Yeah.
Like, initially Batman was very goofy. Batman had the blue cape. Batman had the grey outfit. You know, he had like the Adam West original 1966 Batman movie. That was how Batman comics were for a long time. So until people like Mazzucchelli, people like Frank Miller came about, they made Batman serious, and it was cool to like Batman again. So I will say Batman Begins did the same thing for the movies, because Batman was dead in the movies for like 10 years, and then Nolan comes in, actually takes the medium seriously, isn't like looking at it as like, oh, this is like children's goofy superhero thing. They're like, okay, no, this is a cool concept that we can actually do something with in like a serious lens. So I think that's like a huge success of why like a lot of people love Dark Knight, Batman Begins, and all.
I think the biggest reason people love the Dark Knight is the Joker, the villain. Usually, no matter how good your superhero is, he's only as good as the villain that he defeats. Like a superhero without a villain is almost like
I feel like the success of both of these characters, like you said, you like Spider-Man, you said you like Batman. Both of them have interesting rogues galleries, which means they have like interesting villains to like play against with. So like if you challenge the morality of the hero in like an interesting way, that's when you get. This is a thing that comes from mythology also, right?
Fantasy is focusing on the character's psychological.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to find out what's like interesting about that character, and then you have to like go in on that. So Spider-Man's interesting because he's like broke and working class, and like he's got no other means, but he's so addicted to thinking, no, you have to do the right thing, you have a responsibility. That's a very interesting, like simple thing to communicate to a child. So if you grew up reading Spider-Man, you still have some Spider-Man in you. Like, you know, you
I hope it's not the webs. It's not the sticky webs.
To some degree, but like it gets it gets in you somewhere. You know?
No, but even for me, like Spider-Man 2 was an important film, right? Because when it came out, in my opinion, Spider-Man 2 is one of the best superhero movies ever made. Dr. Octopus as a villain is supreme. But like when Spider-Man 2 came out and my friends were going to the theater and watching it, and I really wanted to go, and my mother was like, "No, you're not going to go. You can't go watch this movie." But my dad is the kind of person who'll come and give you the money on the side saying, "Go."
Yeah.
And like
Yeah, so that's
and
the
like
thing,
my
like-
dad gave me the money to go. I saw it. When I came back, there was a massive fight at home between my parents because me watching Spider-Man 2.
Yeah.
I still got to see Spider-Man 2 in the theater.
Yeah, I think I was fortunate enough that like by the time I was out watching these movies, they'd like sort of taken over public zeitgeist in a way where like it was the cool thing to watch.
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
like when Endgame and Infinity War came out, like that was what everyone was talking about anyway. So when I was younger and I was talking about comics or superheroes with my classmates, I was not very popular because of the things that I was into. Like I would be drawing these comic books in class, and they would be just be like, "He's into some nerd shit." But like by the time I'm like slightly older and I'm in college and stuff like that, these things have become so popular that it's no longer like frowned upon. Right.
Hmm.
So like at that point it was like the cool thing to like
Yeah, and like okay, before we go on with this, I want to bring it back to the villains conversation. So the villain in Musalman, by the way, is this character called Tanasha, and Tanasha pretty much represents the dictatorial leader of our country, quote unquote. He's a caricature for the leader. So Tanasha is the villain, and overcoming Tanasha is actually the like I think a problem we all can relate to and we face in our daily lives. Hence, that becomes a symbolic figure. But coming back to the conversation we were having, I think there was a seminal point that happened in the year 2008 where things changed for all of us is when the first Iron Man movie came out. Because at that time when it happened, Marvel was actually a company that was going bankrupt. They'd sold away some of the best characters, the X-Men, the Spider-Man, because
Sony had
they didn't
Spider-Man,
have money.
Fox had X-Men.
And they took their B-list character, which was Iron Man, and they took an actor called Robert Downey Jr., who at that time was like, almost box office poison.
Yeah.
Like he'd gone through drug
Basically
issues,
blacklisted from-
and he was never gonna like. Last time he'd been in a big movie was like 10 years ago or something. So they took like an IP that almost was like nobody really cared for, to an actor that was almost like box office poison. They put it together and made the Iron Man movie, which kind of kickstarted the MCU as we know it, and which is basically made superheroes. Unfortunately, so mainstream that every other movie that you see now is a
is
a
trying to
superhero
like
movie.
replicate
Yeah.
some sort of formula, right? And there is
Who was your favorite superhero?
My favorite superhero, I was Wolverine and Batman were my two favorite superheroes growing up. And Wolverine more so because the whole claws and how Hugh Jackman played him in the X-Men movies. Because if you notice that the same thing, the common thing between both Batman and Wolverine is that they're anti-heroes of some sort. They're not like you're out in the daylight, like, thing like Batman operates at night. Wolverine is like an anti-hero. He's part of the X-Men, but he's always like away from them, and like his powers make him badass. So like both of them are anti-heroes of sorts, and that's what I think made me like a little bit more drawn to these characters. Yeah. But also like from a satirical perspective, there's a character called the Tick. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Tick, but on Amazon there's a show called the Tick. There's 2 seasons of it. It came out before the boys did. So the Tick I really like was it's so unserious. Like it's just like it's the funniest superhero show that I've seen, and it played a huge influence on me when I was creating my character because of how like comical it was. Have you seen the Tick?
yeah. I've read some of purely for research purposes. I've read some
Yeah.
more, like comics. I think there was a cartoon series as well.
There was a
like,
cartoon series back in the day as well. Yeah.
I like Moon Knight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I because that's also like a really interesting deconstruction of like the whole Batman vigilante sort of idea. Because hey, if we put that kind of pressure in like that sort of setting in like a real human being, maybe he would be a little bit psychotic. Maybe he's like a little like hardcore broken inside. I think I like that idea, and I read like a lot of Moon Knight comics recently that I really liked. So like currently it's Moon Knight. I started with Spider-Man, so like Spider-Man's always up there for me. But yeah,
Yeah, and I feel for me also like the like for me V for Vendetta and Watchmen were also very important because V for Vendetta, yeah, the movie is okay, but when you actually read the graphic novel, you see the amount of depth and philosophy that's in the book, which the movie doesn't even touch upon. So like if V for Vendetta, I always recommend people read the graphic novel as opposed to the movie. Whereas in the Watchmen movie, like I think when I saw Rorschach, even though I might disagree with Rorschach's point of view now, him being a right-wing nut, but like when you saw the Watchmen movie, like Rorschach was like such a cool character. Like you're seeing things from his perspective. It's so nihilistic, and he's kept his identity hidden even from his own like teammates and whatnot sort of thing. So Rorschach and V for Vendetta. Like for me, Alan Moore was an important like person. So even in my comic book Musalman, when I was writing it, like I was taking inspiration from that. In V for Vendetta, there's a scene where V goes into the newsroom and like takes it over and puts out his message. So when I was creating Musalman, I took that scene and I rewrote it Musalman in it. Where in my comic there's a character called Arnab Kauswami, based on Arnab Goswami, and like he challenges Musalman to come on the show. So Musalman goes and Musalman puts forth his perspective in a sort of way. So for me, like I took a scene from a comic book I like, rewrote it my way, and that kind of gave me the entry point into my own story to tell it my way. So like if you like a superhero that you like, feel free to like copy it, but change it just enough so that you can make it your own. I feel that's a one way of like work for me, and I think hopefully works for other people too.
Do any of you like draw, write? No? You do? You're an artist? Are you an artist?
So I am trying to make some comments.
Yeah? Do you like superhero stuff in general, or like do you like
No, I like the political stuff.
political stuff?
Artsman, Gujarati.
Art Spiegelman. Yeah. So again, Art Spiegelman comics are also heavily influenced by the fact that he was so severely affected by the Holocaust, right? Like
Holocaust, yeah.
Mouse is entirely about like that whole experience, kind of again being Trojan horse into like a very simplistic cats versus mice versus pigs.
So that's the
sort
thing.
of.
I think one of my favorite comedians, Stuart Lee, has this saying: "It is satire if it has animals in it."
Yeah.
Like it's just like make the characters animals, and you can
You have to put like one level of like masking on top of like an idea, right? Like so, what he does and what our common friend George Abupen has a very popular comic strip called Ashram. And I think the success of these books is that you're putting this superhero lens on top of superhero sort of like costume on top of like a very simple sort of idea, to the point where you have to understand a lot of things and be a little self-critical to read it and understand that hey, I'm being made fun of. Like I don't think like a person who's like bigoted and like extremely like the kind of person that Rastaman's making fun of can easily pick up Rastaman, read it, and understand they're being made fun of unless they have a little self-reflexivity. I think it's the same thing with your book as well.
No, I feel like Musalman is more in your face. I mean, the name suggests it so as well.
Yeah, but the messaging is like you're not directly.
Yeah, exactly. It's not directly attacking, but also it's like, how do I say? Like, when you look at some media, they just react to what's going on in the news, and you're always going to be two steps behind if you're reacting, in my opinion. So for me, it was putting forth a proactive vision that yes, whatever's going on is going on, but here's my story, and it's going to happen in my own ballpark sort of thing. I'm not going to play your game.
Yeah.
Come see my version of reality sort of thing. So it's like a subtle thing. And another writer, like besides Alan Moore, that I'm usually inspired by is this guy called Grant Morrison.
Yeah.
And Grant Morrison believes that comics are a form of magic. Both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison believe that's a form of magic. But Grant Morrison's take is that it's a hyper sigil. A sigil, for those who don't know, is like he says that if you have a desire, you write down the desire, you cancel out the vowels and the repeating consonants, and whatever letters you have, you can create a symbol out of that, and that's your sigil. Whereas he says that a comic book is a hyper sigil. Not only you're telling the world what you want, you're telling them how you want it. So like when you create this and you put it out there, you're kind of creating a voodoo model of the world. You're making a few changes, sort of thing, and then that kind of manifests into reality. For example, in my comic here, I made like a character that's based on Elon Musk called Melon Musk, and he goes on Joe Rogan's podcast. So when we were like making this comic in particular, what happened was Elon Musk had been on Joe Rogan's podcast before, but he'd been on the old set. But when we were drawing this, my illustrator asked me, "Do you want to do it in the new set or the old set?" I'm like, "Put on the new set so that it'll be more relevant." We put out this comic on Friday, on like I think Jan 9 to 2021. We put out on a Friday. Next Friday, real Elon Musk and real Joe Rogan's podcast sitting in the same set. And I'm like, yo, what the hell is going on? Did I like?
That's the thing about being preemptive, right? Like understanding certain trends, and you can kind of successfully predict the future.
Predict the future, but also you can use it for personal gain. Like in the sense where I don't know how it is over here, but in Bangalore and cities like Bombay, as a Muslim, it's very hard to find a house. Like if you're like looking for a house and you call a realtor, the realtor will be like only take you to a Muslim landlord because I don't want to embarrass you or myself by taking you to a house that you might like, and then they say something like no non-veg allowed or whatever the hell, right? And back in 2022, 23, I was looking for a house. So I created a comic called Musalman Goes House Hunting, and where Musalman's like looking for a house and finds a house. And I put out that comic on a Friday. By the next week, I'd found a house. So it's like becomes a vehicle to like also like fulfill your own personal desires. Like you can really actually use comics as a form of like real world manifestation, and I can say that it has happened. Like it's like you can say it's coincidence, but it's your belief that what you want to put into it.
Yeah.
And I feel it works. Like try and making a comic. Maybe if you're hungry, draw a burger. You might find a burger an hour or two later. It might can work out. Like
Yeah.
like my life is like an adult version of Shakalaka Boom Boom. If you guys remember that show.
Deep cut. Have you guys seen Shakalaka Boom Boom?
No, it's the Hindi belt, bro. That's a Hindi show.
I saw it. Yeah.
Do you watch Shakalaka?
It was there on.
Yeah. Musliman. Yeah. Yeah.
Which comic inspired you the most for?
Like I said, V for Vendetta was a comic that inspired me to like create Musalman. Besides that, like I'm a huge fan of South Park. South Park is an animated TV show in the US, in which their whole like idea is that they make fun of everybody. Like like nothing is sacred. Whatever topic, like they made fun of Christianity and like Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. So everybody said, "You guys must be atheists." Then they made an episode that where they rip apart atheism also. So like South Park has that irreverent kind of humor where like like nothing is sacred, everything goes. So for me, like I grew up watching South Park, and I feel like something like South Park is necessary in India. That kind of humor and like that kind of like taking pot shots at popular figures as well. So Musalman is, in my opinion, like like hugely inspired by South Park and South Park's brand of humor.
And if we're talking about the medium specifically, right? Like comics have historically always been like a counterculture medium, right? We are not in film directly making fun of like the ruling party or like any of that. Like we there's a space in comics where you can sort of have these countercultural ideas and like put them out in a way and like not be viewed with the same level of scrutiny as like if you put that out in a movie. So I think
because I think the defense it is that people for to find out what you've written need to be readers.
yes,
Like a movie anybody can watch or like see a clip of, but you need to be a reader to know what's going on in my comics.
you
Sort
need
of thing.
basic like media literacy to like understand. That's the thing that I was talking about earlier. Like not only do you need that basic literacy, you also need to understand, hey, this is sarcasm, or hey, there's a level of humor that's being placed on top of this to represent an idea, right? So, another thing I wanted to talk about was because you mentioned Grant Morrison was the whole mythology aspect of comics.
Yeah.
Right. So, this is a writer called Joseph Campbell, and he has a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this book is about how there is a sort of commonality in how mythology is written across the world. If we're going from Greco-Roman to Igbo to Indian to any of these mythologies, there is a format to them where a hero story is written in a certain way.
Like for example, if you look at the story of Moses, there's a prophecy that he's going to bring down the ruler. So the ruler has a genocide of children, but despite something, he survives. He gets put in a basket, put into water, and he's lands somewhere safe, and he grows up there.
That is Krishna.
That too, same thing, Krishna. Yes, exactly.
So we cannot really go back and like try to exactly trace why these commonalities exist.
Yeah.
Maybe there's like some sort of shared common myth between like cultures that we don't know about.
Everybody has a story of a great flood.
Yeah.
Like
so, there's like a lot of things that appear. I was learning about this in college when I was learning about comics, and I initially didn't understand why. Basically, like for a long time, I didn't understand why I was reading Campbell. And Campbell writes very dry. Like it's a lot of just like information. So after a point, I was just like, what is the point of this? But by the end of this, you sort of, in making comics, in like reading superheroes, you understand that superhero comics are like a spiritual sequel or a continuation to mythology. And what mythology does is essentially, Campbell talks about how mythology has a sociological function. That's something we were talking about earlier. So it's basically things that you want to see changes being made in society, or like untold rules in society are sort of enforced by mythology. Mythology comes from this idea that initially when we had like a lot of things, natural phenomenon that we couldn't understand, we had to find an explanation for them. Same thing as when you're children and you don't know things, you want to like find an interesting explanation for them, right? So mythology comes from that. And you sort of build these myths based on that. So Atlas holding up the heavens, or like creatures who are like capable of superhuman feats. That's what translates directly to comics. Superman is basically just a new age version of, you know.
But
the
when you
Justice
look at
League.
something that's even more specific, I think even Grant Morrison talks about in his book called Super Gods, is that if you look at Hermes was a god of language, and Hermes was fast, and his symbol was the lightning bolt. And which superhero has a symbol of the lightning bolt? Flash. Flash's ears are lightning bolts.
Yeah, and
So
if
a
you
lot
look
of
at like
these
old Flash
superheroes,
comics, the
yeah.
original helmet, he has the Hermes helmet, right? Like he's
Yeah.
got the same design.
So a lot of these superheroes almost directly are influenced by mythological figures. In fact, Grant Morrison says that the Justice League is the New Age Mount Olympus. You have representation of all of the Greek gods
Greek
in
gods.
like some form of superhero comics
Yeah.
and whatnot.
So like I think it's important to like for homegrown superheroes. If you're an aspiring comic book writer and you like superheroes and you want to make superheroes, I think it's important that we like make that in like an interesting reflection to what society's problems are now, what are the things that we are facing now, what kind of silent rules should we enforce into culture through comics.
And
through
but also
superheroes,
that's still
right?
looking at the outside, right? I feel like my personal belief is that your story or your comic is only good if you make it personal.
Yeah.
And the more personal it is, the more unique it is, and the more truth comes out. So
Exactly.
yeah, even more than like reflecting about society's problems, when you look inwards and look at your own issues,
Yeah.
they're symptomatic of what the larger problem is, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Like for me, dude, like so with Musalman, see, I grew up in an environment where like it was told to me that being Muslim is bad, sort of a thing, because 9/11 happened, and after 9/11 there's this whole propaganda that Islam is bad, Islam is bad,
And because
it's a
we're
terrorist religion.
consuming a lot of media from the West.
And then Godra riots happen in India and all of that stuff. So like I grew up hating my religion to the point where I was like an ardent atheist. From the point I was 15, 16 to the point where I was like an out and out atheist, and for me Musalman initially was like a way to like make fun of my own community, is what I was looking at. But it changed over time, and my own journey also has evolved with the character. Like what I believed in when I started writing Musalman is probably different from what I believe in now.
Sort of antithetical to.
Yeah, well, it became a process of self discovery, and because of being a creator Muslim, people have conversations with me, they suggest books to me, or whatever, like starts changing my mind little by little by little. So it is actually also a way of it's a personal medium and a vehicle for personal change above society. I feel like society is वो तो होता रहेगा.
No,
keeps happening.
no. So for Prowlers, this is not a superhero comic. This is like a mystery. If you've seen Goosebumps or read Goosebumps, it's sort of like that kind of vibe. And I wrote this when I was in college in Bangalore, and we were in the outskirts of Bangalore, it's a place called Yelahanka. So there was a problem where, because we were in art school, we all dress a certain way, we all have like colored hair, and we all like kind of stand out from the crowd a little bit, and like we were not really exactly popular with the locals at that point, right? So this comic is a reflection of our experiences as students living in this town, where we felt more kinship towards the animals, the dogs, the stray dogs, than the people there. So like, even though that in essence is a sociological sort of reflection, right? Like it's about society that you live in, but it comes through what we experience as students, or I experienced as a student at that time. So like, even when you're writing about the world, you're writing about it from
Your perspective.
Yeah. So like, ultimately, when you make content that's your own, you make stories that's your own, it needs to come from within you as a reflection of.
So even when you were talking about Joseph Campbell, like Joseph Campbell's teachings have been condensed into this thing called Story Circle by Dan Harmon. Dan Harmon is the creator of Community, and he's also the creator of Rick and Morty. You guys watch Rick and Morty? So in Rick and Morty, he's come up with the 8-step process of the Story Circle. The hero's journey condensed into 8 steps.
Yeah.
And when I started writing, the Story Circle was very important to me, because like I had a notice board and I stuck it up on my notice board. And anytime I'm stuck with the story, I'd look at the next step and try and answer that question, and the story would move forward. But that was still surface level. It's only when I read Joseph Campbell for myself is when I actually understood the deeper meanings of it. It's not just a surface level thing. And the Joseph Campbell, the legend of Joseph Campbell, is the fact that this book, Hero with 1,000 Faces, George Lucas read it before making Star Wars. The Wachowskis read it before making Matrix. So any big franchise that in the world has drawn inspiration from Joseph Campbell's work. And
I would like to say, like, I would like to recommend it to people to read, but it's very difficult.
It's a very difficult. But also Joseph Campbell. The thing is that on YouTube also there are enough talks of him, where he's actually like talking about his stuff. Instead of if you feel like reading it is like really dense, There's
I
also
would say,
like
I would say if
YouTube.
you're like really committed to like writing, or like if you're committed to like making stories, or if you're interested in this sort of medium, I think it's very important that you like go through it. But yeah, it's not something that like makes sense to you right away. I would say, I think we had the same conversation
Hmm.
yesterday about like
Hmm.
initially not understanding it,
Hmm.
and then eventually just clicking.
Yeah.
Right.
No, but also the thing is that we've spoken a lot about Western influences,
Yeah.
but like let's come back to where we are, right? So for me, like when I was creating Musalman or when I wanted to make Musalman, I tell people what I wanted to do, and people would tell me, "Man, this is like too ahead of its time. The audience is not ready for it. Like, how are you gonna like make this? Aren't you afraid? There's no whatever." So like in 2017, I was actually traveling and I was in UP and I was in a little town called Faizabad. Faizabad is a town near Ayodhya. Ayodhya, as we all know, is the big Ram temple. It actually, funnily, it used to be Faizabad district and Ayodhya town, but now it's Ayodhya district and Faizabad town.
Of course.
So I was in Faizabad and I met a Hindi literature professor from Faizabad. And I was telling him, like I have this story, but when I tell people, people are like, audience is not there, whatever,
Yeah.
like, what are you going to. So he actually went to his bookshelf and he pulled out a writer that not a lot of people know about now, but he was famous back in the day, called Hari Shankar Parsai. Have you heard of Parsai?
No.
So Harishankar Parsai was a writer in the 1960s and 50s who used to write Hindi satire, where he used to like take Ramayana and Mahabharata stories but put them like in the context of the Congress government of the time and parody them, but in the context of like the mythological stories. For example, there's a story in his book called Ayodhya after Ramayana where the monkeys who fought Ram's war versus Ravana are now war veterans without jobs, and they're like trying to unionize, and they basically trying to like form like a union to petition Ram to like, hey, give us like benefits or whatever. And Ram says, whoever has war wounds, based on your war wounds, we'll give you like benefits. So like a monkey is sitting at home making cuts on his own hand, like bruises and stuff. His wife's like, what are you doing, man? And he's
What
like,
is the book called?
Ayodhya after Ramayana is the name of the story. So then he's saying ki like wife is like, what are you doing? He's like, Ram said based on war wounds you'll get like benefits. She's like, won't they see your wounds are fresh and war wounds are old? He's like, no, you give some money under the table, it all works out. So like making fun of the corruption at the time. Another story that he did is where like the famous story in Lakshman gets poisoned and Hanuman has to take the Sanjeevani booty to Lanka. So in this one, Hanuman gets stopped by customs officials for drug trafficking, but then like because it's for the family, he's allowed to go, because like how the Congress Gandhi family at that time was like ruling stuff. So like he was parodying all of these things, the politics of the time, but within the context of Ramayana, Mahabharata stories. Lucky for him, guns were not easily accessible back then. Like sometimes when he's been walking back from his office to his home, people have beaten him with lathis. They have, but like luckily he was not shot on. But like we have a history of satire that goes back to like hundreds of years. Even if you look at a Ram Leela performance that happens during Dasera time, there's a habit of people to like satirize people, like make fun of the richest person in your community, or like the large groups of people in the village. It becomes a vehicle to satire. So the thing that there is no history of satire in India is a false thing. There's rich history. I'm guessing even Malayalam here, you guys would have like crazy satire.
So much stuff. Like I
The newspaper cartoons.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, the most famous.
yeah. Shankar is one famous one. Yeah.
Yeah. And like newspaper cartoons, again, being satirical is like an important thing, because like newspaper cartoons, if you look at the origin of newspaper cartoons, they were like blatantly used just to like peddle propaganda, right? Like so in America, like way back in the day, it was like a vehicle to just like enhance the amount of like hatred Americans had towards Mexican people, or like during Jim Crow administration to like persecute black people even more. So it's important that like it's come full circle in a way that like there's like satirical media as part of newspaper cartoons now, that isn't just like the big man sort of like enforcing their idea through
Well,
that.
even the newspaper cartoons become a historical record of the time that they were created in. Even in fact, when Shankar was making comics, I think Nehru made a statement saying, "Don't spare me, Shankar." Like like I see that you're not making fun of me directly. I am not anybody sacred. Make fun of me as well, is what Nehru's perspective was back in the 50s and 60s. And now
Must be nice.
now we're in a whole different world where you can't even like utter the name. It's like Voldemort. You can't
Yeah.
say Modi, and if you get away
You
with
said
it. I can say it. I'm Muslim, bro. But like, so we just use the code word Tanasha. We'll like censor it out in the video. But it's like,
Came to Amit Shah or something.
huh?
I think it's like a
It's an
conglomeration.
amalgamation
Yeah.
of both, like sort of a thing. So it represents dictatorial rule, and I think both of them are hand in glove.
Yeah.
In terms of
Speaking of V for Vendetta, right? Like
Yeah.
There's the whole North Fire party in V for Vendetta,
Mm.
which is like a. It's not directly talking about one specific authoritarian regime. It's like mixing ideas from like
Mm.
the British like politics at the time. It's taking ideas from like
Nazism.
the Nazi party. So it's not always like a one-to-one correlation when you
Yeah, you're like taking. But also sometimes what happens, especially for V for Vendetta, it was written in the 80s where like Alan Moore showed a surveillance state with CCTV cameras everywhere. And unfortunately, by the late 90s, Britain had become that state.
Yeah.
It was almost like he manifested those ideas or like gave them ideas because they didn't have the imagination,
Yeah.
but gave them ideas to do it in sort of a way.
Everything is happening with boys, I think.
The Boys, yeah.
Boys.
I think Boys is
I think
something
The Boys
that,
is another version of this where like
Yeah.
I think they predicted a lot of things before like it happened, right? Like again, because it's being disguised in this like superhero costume. People like initially when the first seasons happened, people all across the board were like really big fans of the show. But the more the show goes on and the more overtly political and like specific the show gets and it gets closer to what's happening in reality, I think a lot of like conservative groups are like now boycotting the show or like have turned on the show suddenly because they think, oh no, now we can clearly see this is making fun of us.
Yeah, but also whatever happens in the show already exists in the comics.
Yeah.
Like, so usually I feel like a comics is a place where the ideas take birth and grow, and then it can evolve into a visual medium. For me, like, you know, like our local superheroes like Krish and stuff don't stand water because there's no canon, there's no
Yeah,
like
there's-
deeper mythology with these characters. They're just like commercial pieces.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like for a
I think
superhero
Shaktiman
to
is like an outlier in that sense because Shaktiman had like a long run of like just like
yeah.
space to build.
But Shaktiman was also borrowing from
Superman.
existing Superman stories,
Yeah.
Gangadhar and all of that stuff. So
Yeah.
it was like a very thinly veiled thing.
Any Shaktiman fans?
Yeah. Actually, they bind it with the religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't go to that alien idea.
Alien idea.
After that, they started to make Star Wars Iron Man.
Yeah.
And it was a core.
Yeah,
yeah.
It was talking about
There was
science
just
and comic
copy.
and-
Yeah. I remember Arya Man. He had
Yeah,
the cape and
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
There was security details.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a small robot guy.
There's also this show called Captain Vyom, which was a Star Trek ripoff, which was like pretty much there on DD as well.
If you're familiar with like other Raj Comics characters also, those were all fairly one-to-one copies of like what Marvel and DC were doing at the time. So that's another thing. So like when I was making comics, and because I was reading a lot of superhero comics, and I looked at the comic space in India, I realized like it's either that or it's just straight up mythology comics. And like the reason for me choosing the kind of genres and like the kind of stories that I work with is that I think we should just not just do everything that's just already been done before. Like I can probably off the top of my head list like 5-6 versions of the Ramayana that's come out in comics by Amar Chitragatha or Graphic India or any of these companies, and like there's just so much oversaturation of just mythology comics in the market that I wanted to specifically be like, hey, this is not just the only comic identity we have as Indians. We should have other things as well.
So like another influence that I had was this guy called Harvey Pekar. So in the US also they had an underground comics movement there. There were popular comics, but there was highly adult comics created by people like Robert Crumb and
Zine culture basically.
Yeah, and Harvey Pekar had a series called American Splendor, where he'd actually take scenes from everyday conversations. He was a hospital clerk, and stuff that he'd overhear in the hospital or just kind of conversations his friends would have amongst each other about being lonely or whatever, and he turned those into comics. So like comics don't always have to be like about like, you know, great triumph and like super like powers and whatnot. They're also reflective of highly human stories. Like sometimes you can be having conversation with a friend, you might not want to be able to pull out the camera and film that, but you can remember it and like weave it into like a character's dialogue later on. And another thing for me was that for me creating Musalman was important because it was at the time I was hating what was happening in the superhero medium. Like I hated Marvel because I feel like the MCU is a very like enforcing the status quo kind of a comic. I think for me, my least favorite Marvel movie is the Guardians of the Galaxy because I have like conspiracy theories about it. Okay, so I mean, I
like that movie.
I smoked a joint and I went to watch it in the theater, and I feel like the propaganda of Disney came apart for me. Because you see Nova Prime, they're Caucasian people and they're like this country that's oppressing a colored people, and Nova Prime to me felt like a parallel of Israel, whereas like the Cree, who are a colored people whose culture has been subjugated for years and years and years and want to fight back, felt like a little bit of Palestine or any culture that has been like colonized over a period of time. And then Guardians of the Galaxy are like America, and they come and save the day and have the Nova Prime. And for me, that's a very like Israel Palestine parallel that I saw when I was watching Guardians. And after that, every Marvel movie that I watched, I looked at it from that lens of what is the subtle message that they're actually throwing. Because Marvel
so, like,
works with
a lot of this is like a very serious criticism that like the Marvel movies have been facing for a lot of time, that it's like in defense of the American military industrial complex, right? Like it's
like Captain Marvel is a pilot, is a female pilot, so they get all the
straight up an
equipment,
army.
everything. They get equipment and stuff to film because they're army.
Which is the thing, right? Like so Captain America is relevant during the 1940s because there's a world war going on and there's like an active effort to like recruit people to like fight the Nazis, right? If you just continue that same line of propaganda and that same line of like ideology all the way through, it becomes poisoned, and it becomes, in the context of the modern world, it's like it's completely different.
No, but it's also because when corporations come in, like I'm pretty sure the people writing Marvel comics in the 60s or 70s would not agree with what Marvel Cinematic Universe is now.
Absolutely. So
Like-
I don't know, did anyone watch the fourth Captain America movie, the one with the one with Falcon? So there's a character in that who is like called Sabra, and Sabra was a character invented by the creators of Hulk back in I think the 70s, and she was a Israeli superhero, and the point of the character in the 60s or in the 70s, whenever it was in Hulk comics, was as a mirror for the Hulk to look at the actions of this superhero and deem them too extreme even for the Hulk. And the Hulk is a character who is like portrayed as a monster by larger society in Marvel comics, and he looks at the actions of this superhero and like makes her like it makes the Hulk cry. So
Shit.
writers,
I did not know that.
the writers in the back in the day were so aware and like so dialed in on the politics of the world that they were using their platform to do excellent like social commentary for the time. And when we come to the modern day, that character is straight up just portrayed as like a one of the good guys.
Yeah, she's
in the new
actually
movie.
closer to Stormfront in The Boys than it is to any other character.
And like that character in that movie is, in the modern version, is just like a good guy. So you can kind of follow. That's the thing. So when people kind of talk about The Boys, they talk about all these things like we're bringing too much politics into comic books, or we're bringing too much politics into superheroes. I think that's like always been bullshit. Like I think
Comics are a
inherently
like
are
a
a political medium,
Yeah.
and it's always been a political medium. And if you always read X-Men and you got nothing from it other than hey, Wolverine has claws and this guy shoots lasers out of your eyes, you missed the point of X-Men. I think. Like I think there's like a larger conversation that X-Men is trying to do when you engage with that content. I think if you miss that, I think you've like lost the point of like.
Yeah. And even like in my comics, like this collects the first 8 stories, but the stories I've written since then. There's a villain in my comic called Chairman Mouse, who's actually a representative of Mickey Mouse and Chairman Mao, which is both censorship and corporate America, who've come to Musalman and said, we'll make you a global superhero, like make you a franchise, but you can't talk about Palestine, Kashmir, love jihad, all of these issues. You have to self-censor to become more famous is what the storyline is. So for me, like Marvel is almost like representative of the direct villain within my superhero universe. So like if you are fed up with Marvel, Musalman is the thing that you should be reading.
Once again,
the comic books are there. Musalmancomics.com on the website. Instagram Musalman Comics. You can like find me very easily on the internet.
And yeah, I'm Captain Smitey on Instagram. I usually have comics to show at these events. I didn't bring any this time, but you guys can find me on Instagram. And yeah, hopefully next time I'll come back with some more books so you guys can read them as well. If you have any questions, I think
now is the
this
time.
would be the time to like take some questions.
Yeah.
No?
Oh, we are around all day. They always just come up to and ask us where we are. So let's call it.
Yeah, I think Sanid was showing 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think it's
So yeah, thank you so much.
cool. And Jai Shri Allah. That's the